and Kat from Maine Ghost Hunters, and we wanted to introduce you to Fort Halifax. It's mostly overlooked as a serious contender for paranormal activity, and we're not sure why. There's been constant human presence at this site for over 3 millennia. That's over 3,000 years of people doing what people do. And if you're a paranormal enthusiast, you might understand where we're coming from. There were births here, life was lived here, and yes, there were deaths and burials here. The Native Americans used this land in a nomadic fashion, and this was their base for months out of every year. So just imagine the history that's here.
Fort Halifax was among the strongest and most extensive 18th century frontier fortresses ever built in the District of Maine. Its layout included 2 main blockhouses, a barracks and main building called the Fort House, all enclosed by wooden palisades. There were 2 additional blockhouses built outside the compound on a hill overlooking the palisaded fort complex below. The originally approved layout was designed by Major General John Winslow and partially erected by the 500-plus men under his command. However, Major General Winslow was soon reassigned to another mission, and Captain William Lithgow was brought in to replace him in command of Fort Halifax. Lithgow had a vision that included a completely new layout and the restructuring of sections of the fort that had already been put in place. He considered that vision complete on May 30th, 1756. Fort Halifax was a bastion in the Maine wilderness, and it attracted as much attention for those who needed it as those who were opposed to its existence. It was seen as a constant threat to the Native Americans in the region and to the French who had claimed the Kennebec Valley as a part of its empire. The fort and anyone associated with it were in a constant state of threat and danger until the French and Indian War came to an end in 1763. Captain William Lithgow commanded this fort, initially garrisoned with 100 men for 12 years. Life at the fort wasn't always easy. Hardships ranged from lack of food and clothes to injury and disease, the constant threats of Indian attacks, and many other day-to-day concerns that oftentimes could have meant the difference between life and death. Daily concerns about safety and survival were often balanced with happier times that reminded residents that frontier life wasn't all hazard and struggle. Yes, there were deaths at the fort, but there were also births and marriages, social events, celebrations, and impromptu fun times that made for great stories. A few examples for your consideration. In the winter, Captain Lithgow liked to have his men clear the snow off the ice-covered Kennebec River so the men could slide the ladies across the top. In warmer months, the soldiers and their wives would take excursions to a nearby island for dinner outings and barbecues. Sporting men would wager their liquor rations for a chance to take home the big win with target practice competitions. And it was a nightly routine for residents of the fort, soldiers and family members alike, to gather around the fire, listening to each other tell stories, play music, and to sing and dance. The fort was functional in all ways, and it existed in large part to support a community the British Empire wanted to see grow in the Kennebec Valley region. Having fun and bringing enjoyment to life at Fort Halifax was a major step in making this place feel welcome to new settlers and safe and normal to permanent residents. Fort Halifax was abandoned by the military in 1767 and sold into private ownership by 1770. For the next 30 years, buildings in the complex would serve the community as places to hold social gatherings and dances, church services, and town meetings. By 1800, all of Fort Halifax except the sole remaining blockhouse still standing today was torn down and removed. The land and blockhouse were sold in and out of possession of numerous deed holders until 1924, when it fell into the capable and historic-minded hands of the Daughters of the American Revolution, a preservationist group dedicated to making sure this piece of Maine's history is saved from further insults of time. In 1966, the blockhouse was turned over to the state of Maine for safekeeping and routine maintenance. The beautifully preserved blockhouse on the grounds of Fort Halifax is original to the year 1754. It's the oldest blockhouse still standing in America today, a national treasure and a relic to the days of the French and Indian War. If you're a history buff who's also into paranormal, or vice versa, you're probably wondering whether or not Fort Halifax is haunted. From the standpoint of evidence, we have none that would suggest this location has spirit activity. It's located at a fairly busy area of the city, and because of that, it's not an ideal spot to obtain dependable evidence without some next level effort. But could it be haunted? Absolutely, it could be. A better question might be, why wouldn't it be haunted? The entire Fort Halifax site has had a constant human presence for over 3,000 years because it was used as a Native American fishing village by semi-nomadic tribes. So for months out of every year, this was home to a large number of people. They lived here, were born here, celebrated life achievements here, birthdays, weddings, and of course deaths. Every aspect of life happened here, and archaeologists have found many artifacts attesting to that very fact. Items like native pottery, nails, parts to tobacco pipes, axe heads, horse bits, cannonballs, animal and fish bones, and eggshells. But one of the most significant discoveries regarding the Native American presence that existed at the Fort Halifax site before colonial settlers took it over was of an Indian burial found no more than 100 feet from the original blockhouse that still stands today. Not to mention the really difficult time colonial settlers and soldiers had during harsh winters here. The first winter Fort Halifax was in operation was awful. Many men were starving, freezing, and so sick they couldn't fend for themselves. 5 men died. So, could Fort Halifax be haunted? There is no doubt Fort Halifax has all the characteristics a serious ghost hunter would be looking for at any reputable haunted hotspot. No doubt. Thousands of years of human activity concentrated at the convergence of 2 moving bodies of water. This location is a paranormal enthusiast dream come true, and it's free to visit.
So here are 10 things I think you might want to know about Fort Halifax. The first is when and why it was built. It was built in 1754 to bring stability to British landholdings along the Kennebec River. The French were also in the District of Maine, and they were constantly threatening to come to the Kennebec River because the Kennebec River region, because they considered the Kennebec River to be a boundary to their landholdings, so they thought it was theirs. And the British claimed it for themselves, and so there was constant conflict. And there were hostile and aggressive Native Americans around this area, so there were no British settlers up here. So the British decided, hey, we'll put a fort here, and it will stabilize the area and allow British settlers to move up past Richmond, Maine. Richmond, Maine had Fort Richmond, and that's basically where settlement stopped because nobody felt safe settling above that fort. There was no protection. So this fort here in this area brought stability and a sense of security to potential settlers. It was built in 1754 at the beginning of the French and Indian War. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but I'm mentioning it again so that you know what was happening in the region. The second thing I think you might want to know is about this blockhouse itself. This is the oldest still standing wooden blockhouse in America. It was here when Fort Halifax was here in 1754. It was built along with all the other blockhouses that no longer exist. This blockhouse did fall victim to the Great Flood of 1987, in which the Kennebec River, it was a devastating flood. The Kennebec River raised in great heights, so high, nobody in this area thought that it would raise above the banks here, and it did. And it got so high, it floated this whole blockhouse off. Anyway, the blockhouse floated down the river, and parts and pieces of it were found all up and down the river. They almost made it out. It almost made it out to open water. But a bunch of pieces were recovered. Not all the recovered pieces could be put back into the blockhouse because they were damaged too badly, but a lot of pieces were. I believe 22 original wall pieces were recovered, and then a master contractor who was seasoned with historic rebuilds and historic remodels was contracted to put this back together. The third thing I think you might want to know about Fort Halifax, like the whole fort, which was like this whole area here, is that the fort itself wasn't built here initially. It was fashioned, put together. I need to use the right words to make sure that you understand what I mean. It was initially constructed at a place called Fort Shirley in a town called Frankfort, Maine. This was back in the 1750s. Frankfort doesn't exist anymore, not there anyway. It is now Dresden, Maine. And if you go to the Pownellborough Courthouse, which is another, this is a total aside, it's another very historic place in Maine. John Adams tried a case there. They hung a man right outside of the Pownellborough Courthouse in Dresden. Definitely go there if you're into history. But anyway, they fashioned all the parts and pieces for all the pieces of the fort right there in Dresden because they couldn't do it here. They couldn't do it here because there's a reason why they were building a fort here. There was hostile threats all around the area. So when the Kennebec proprietors were tasked with building a fort, they were asked to build a fort here, and they said, no, we're not going to send men to their deaths just to build a fort. We have to come up with a different idea. And so the idea was to basically build a fort kit at Dresden, or Frankfurt at the time. And so what they did was they brought in a whole bunch of men. The men cut down all of the wood needed to build the fort pieces. They measured them, they cut them, they put them together to make sure everything was all set and ready to go. And then they made rafts out of those pieces. They put the rafts in the water. They rafted all of the parts and pieces up to Fort Western, where they took everything out of the water and they hand trucked it through the wilderness, uncut wilderness at that time, 18 miles up the river to here, where they put everything that they had in their possession together. It wasn't the entire fort. It was enough that they could consider it fortified when they were finished with it. And then after that, then they started building more buildings inside of the fort walls. So that's how it happened. And impressively, it only took 56 days from start to finish. It's fascinating. So the fourth thing I think you might want to know, this is probably the longest. Prepare yourselves. And it's also the most fascinating though. Was the fort ever attacked directly? The answer is no. Certain documentation might lead you to believe it was, but really the fort was monstrous. It was very intimidating. Indians didn't attack it directly. What they did is they did attack the men who left the fort walls. So as you can see, I don't know if you could see, there's a river right outside here, right off that boundary there. I mean, we're right on the water. And then there's another one right here. It's two rivers coming together. That's what makes this place so special and what made this place so important for the Native American tribes who used it. Now, there's a bit of history here. Well, there's all history, but so the fort was built in 1754 at the very start of the French and Indian War. In May of 1754, 2 Indians were murdered in the District of Maine, and a very short time after that, 2 more were murdered in Boston. And this set off a spate of revenge killings on settlers by Native Americans all through, well, at least the District of Maine. So by November, this is where we see our first attack here at Fort Halifax. Now, Fort Halifax had just been finished within like a week or 2, and that's when the first attack happened. And it happened just outside the fort walls. 2 men were shot and killed. I believe they were fishing. And then a little bit later on, another man was shot, but he wasn't killed. He was injured. He was severely injured, but he survived. That was in November of 1754. 1755, we have 2 more incidents. One involved a man being shot outside the fort walls. He was just minding his own business. He was just out there either fishing or hunting or maybe cutting wood, whatever it was. He wasn't out there causing trouble. He wasn't hunting Indians. He was just doing something for himself. There was Indians in the area and they killed him. The second one is even more fascinating. It involved a man named Edward Whelan. Now, Edward Whelan was a courier. He was basically a courier. His job was to take dispatches from Fort Western to Fort Halifax and Fort Halifax to Fort Western. So he was up here at Fort Halifax. He went down to Fort Western to pick up and drop off some dispatches, and on his way back, he just disappeared. He just never came back. Now, nobody ever knew what happened to him. They surmised what happened to him. I mean, they guessed. Did he drown? Did he fall off his boat? Did he get off his boat on purpose and walk away? Where would he go? He probably didn't do that. So the Probably the most obvious thing that happened to him was he was taken by Indians, but there was no evidence that this happened. So nobody really knew what happened to him until 4.5 years later, when he returned. He told the story. He was taken captive by Indians, brought up to Quebec, and sold as a slave. It's a very common thing that happened down in the District of Maine in particular. People were kidnapped all the time and taken up to Quebec and sold as slaves. So that was his story. So this brings me to the 1757 attack on men from this fort. So in 1757, it's spring, it's 1757, and these men, everybody in the fort had, pretty much suffered through another long, harsh winter, and they're getting cabin fever for sure. I'm sure of it. So by the time it got warm and the snow is melting and they can get out and they can get outside these walls and they can go fishing and they can go hunting and cut their wood and all that sort of thing, that's what they did. So a small hunting party got together, small being 10 to 12 men. They left the confines of the fort together. They went hunting, and at the end of the night when they came back, 5 men were missing. The rest of the party didn't know what happened to these 5 men. There were no signs that anything went awry out there in the wilderness, so it was a surprise to them that these 5 men didn't come back. When I say there was no sign, there was no loud sounds that indicated there was a struggle going on. There was no they didn't find any physical evidence that anything had happened. These guys just disappeared. And so it sent a panic through the fort. Everybody in the fort was very worried because these guys went missing. So Captain Lithgow decided he needed to respond to this immediately. So he sent 10 men down the river in rafts or boats or however it was that they got down the river. They went down the river to Fort Western to notify Fort Western that there were hostiles in the area and just to be on high alert. On the way back, these 10 men in these 2 rafts were attacked by a small band of Indians on the riverside. So they started shooting at the men, and they hit 2 of Fort Halifax's men. All the men in the boat started panicking. One of the boats managed to make it to the shore, and the men got out and they hid behind obstacles so that they wouldn't get shot. But the other boat couldn't manage to maneuver their little craft to safety, and so they're just sitting out there like fish in a bucket, basically. They're just getting shot at, and it was a bad scene. So they're firing back real desperately, hoping basically to survive this attack. And they hit one of the Indians, and that guy fell in a way that seemed unnatural. And then all of his other friends, Indian friends, rallied. They came around him, and they were looking pretty desperate, and they picked up his body. And basically what the settlers observed was that it looked like they were carrying dead weight. It looked like they had killed that Indian. And so that brings me to point number 5, and that is that was the last negative encounter between settlers and Native Americans on the Kennebec River. Number 6, the 6th thing I think you should know about Fort Halifax has to do with Fort Western. Fort Western's in Augusta. Fort Western was built in 1754 at probably the exact same time as Fort Halifax. As a matter of fact, it's really unclear as to which one was built first. Historians can't agree which one was built first. The point is, Fort Halifax could not survive without Fort Western. I wish I had time to explain to you the ins and outs of the very first winter here at Fort Halifax. And that's a winter that these guys suffered through without support from the outside, because it was the first winter. They had to figure out how to do things, and they couldn't get to Fort Western to get their supplies. Things were so desperate here this first winter. Men were sick. They didn't have the clothes that they needed. They couldn't get out to cut wood because their feet didn't have shoes. The shoes were eaten through. It was awful. They had not enough food. I don't know if I just said that. It was a horrible time. Men died here during this first winter just from being here with no supplies, nothing to help them get through that winter. So you can understand that Fort Western was extremely important to the survival of Fort Halifax and to the settlers that the British were hoping to bring to this area. The reason why Fort Western was so important to Fort Halifax is because cargo ships could not get up past Augusta, and they knew that. They knew that when they built when they were thinking of building Fort Halifax, they knew that ships could not get up past Augusta. That's why they also had to build Fort Western. So what would happen is cargo ships would bring the supplies and stores for Fort Halifax, and they would drop them off at Fort Western. And then Fort Halifax would send men down in bateau, to pick up the stores and to row them up to Fort Halifax. And then we're talking about everything: food, lumber materials, clothes, seeds, just stuff to build settlements, basically. And it was all brought to Fort Western and then boated in small crafts up to Fort Halifax. Okay, so the seventh thing I think you might want to know about Fort Halifax is that who stayed here? Who came here? Were there any famous people here? And the answer is yes. They were here, but they weren't here when it was Fort Halifax, so I will tell you that. Fort Halifax was decommissioned in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War. The British didn't need it anymore, so they basically abandoned it as far as the military goes, but the structures were still here for a while, and the settlers used it as like a community center type, like a town center type setup. And they turned the fort house, which was the officers' quarters. It was a long building, and they turned that fort house into an inn. And so when the Quebec expedition came up here in 1775, all the officers stayed in the inn. So we're talking about Benedict Arnold. We know that he was a traitor to the American cause at the end of his career. Daniel Morgan, who was a French and Indian War hero. He was also a cousin to Daniel Boone. Henry Dearborn, who wound up becoming Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of War, but he was also a general in the War of 1812, which is my favorite war. And then Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was here. Now, Aaron Burr was only 19 years old when he was here, and I just want to tell you a little bit about Aaron Burr, because he was a scoundrel in politics. Oh my gosh, that guy. Read about Aaron Burr sometime. He was something else. But when he was a soldier in his younger years, I mean, he was 19 years old and he was here. His job when he was 19 years old was to protect important military leadership. He was like Secret Service for the military. He was that important. This guy was really good at his job. So he was here. The eighth thing I think you might want to know about Fort Halifax would be the artifacts that were found here. Now, there were a ton of artifacts found here. This location here was used as a prehistoric Indian village. There were 5 prehistoric Indian villages here, used over 3,000 years. We're talking hundreds or 100 generations of Native Americans using this land over periods of time. Consistently, though, like every year they used it as a fishing village because of the two rivers, Kennebec River and Sebastopol River. They converge here at this point. At the end of this land here. And so this was a perfect place to have a fishing village, and they used it every year in nomadic fashion. They used it for a few months and then they moved on to like hunting grounds or whatever. But there were artifacts found here, and we're talking about like fire pots, stone cutting tools, things like that. They were found here. But also, of course, there were artifacts that the British and the settlers left behind. I mean, we're talking all kind of military buttons, flints, plates, saucers, utensils, pottery, like everything, anything you can imagine as far as like what would indicate, what would bring one to believe that there was a heavy settlement here. Those things were found here. And they are being housed at Fort Western. If you ever want to go see them, they're at Fort Western in Augusta. The ninth thing I think you might want to know about Fort Halifax is that the very first town cemetery was put in place by the guy who wound up buying this area. His name was Dr. Sylvester Gardner. Dr. Sylvester Gardner was a doctor, but I think his real passion was in real estate. This guy owned huge tracts of land up and down the Kennebec River. As an example, where Pittston is today, it used to be called Colburn Town, and that's because the Colburns founded it. Dr. Sylvester Gardner sold the Colburns the land that they made Colburn Town with, which is now Pittston, Maine. I think Gardner, Maine is named after Sylvester Gardner. He bought this area here and donated the land for the town's very first public cemetery, or town cemetery. And it's called the Fort Hill Cemetery, if you ever want to visit it. And the 10th thing I think you might want to know, or you might find interesting about Fort Halifax, is what happened to the fort house, because it was the main structure in this complex, like in this whole area. The fort house was the main building. It was a huge, long building, and it existed until 1798. Now, in its earliest of years, it was used for officers' quarters. Then after the fort area was abandoned and then sold into private possession, it was turned into an inn, the fort house. That inn, it functioned as an inn until 1798, when the owner, his name was Richard Thomas, decided that the building was too dilapidated. He couldn't do anything with it anymore. So he had it raised. And then he had another building built in the same footprint, and he turned he turned it into an inn also. He built it to be a hotel basically, and he called it the Halifax House. And so that's what happened to it. I don't know when that building was raised, but it's not here today. So, and then we have the bonus, number 11. Is this place haunted? Is it haunted? The short answer is I'm not sure. The long answer is I don't know how this place could not be haunted. It has had 3,000 to 5,000 years of continuous human activity at this one spot before the British even arrived. Before any of this happened, there were 3,000 to 5,000 years worth of continuous, every single year, a seasonal a seasonal fishing village was set up here by the Native Americans. Every aspect of life happened here. Every aspect. Births, like marriages, birthdays, happiness, sadness, desperation, struggle. If you knew what the first year's officers and soldiers, what like that first winter that they spent here, if you knew what those guys went through, you'd be like, oh, maybe this place is haunted. The first winter here was so awful because they didn't really have the support that they needed. That's why Fort Western was so important. The first winter here, I don't think they were ready for it, and the men here were so in such a bad place through the middle of the winter that they just started quitting their jobs. Where are you gonna go? Nowhere. They were just like dying in place, and I'm not just saying that. They didn't have the clothing that they needed to make it through the winter. I will use the word comfortably, but that's not even the right word. Like, they imagine going through a Maine winter with just like one bed sheet and no socks and shoes, and your clothes are tattered and torn. I mean, it was awful. And every time they went outside to go get wood to cut for a fire, they were getting attacked by Indians. It was awful. Men were sick, very sick, and I don't just mean a cold. I mean, they were very sick. They were starving to death. 5 men died in that first winter. So if you're an American and you're looking back and you're thinking, oh, 200-year-old buildings are really old. Well, yeah, okay, well, this stuff happened in 1754. There were deaths here that were pretty grueling. That's just 1754. Think about what possibly could have happened 3,000 to 5,000 years before that, because it all happened here. This blockhouse is basically a landmark for what I'm about to say. There was, in the 1800s, a body found within 50 feet of this blockhouse, and it was a Native American burial. So yes, there were Native Americans buried here on this site. The reason why we know it was a Native American burial that was uncovered is because it had the typical Native American adornments around its neck. I say it's because I don't know if it was a man or a woman, and the reason why I don't know is because when the skeleton was exposed to the air, it stayed intact. It looked like they could just pick it up and go bring it, someplace to be protected. And when they went to move it, everything disintegrated except for the lower jaw. Okay, so yes, do I think this place could be haunted? I absolutely 100% believe if any place could be haunted, Fort Halifax is a candidate. Okay, so that's the 10 things I think you might want to know about Fort Halifax. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. We love to converse with people, so definitely hit us up in the comments below or email us at maineghosthunters@maineghosthunters.org. Right. Until next time, everybody, thanks for joining us.